Mother Bear got stuck in the car in the home. What this baby did saved her life. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Every bit of your support helps us create even more amazing stories for you. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees surrounding the Marshall family home, casting dappled shadows across the front yard. Inside, little Emma Marshall, just 11 months old, sat on a colorful playmat in the living room, her chubby fingers stacking wooden blocks with determined concentration. Her mother, Sarah Marshall, hummed softly as she prepared breakfast in the kitchen, occasionally glancing at her daughter through the open doorway. The Marshalls had moved to this woodland retreat just 3 months ago, seeking peace away from the busy city life. Their home, nestled at the edge of a sprawling forest, offered the perfect balance of comfort and wilderness. The garage connected directly to their kitchen through a door that Sarah often left slightly ajar to let fresh air circulate throughout the house. That morning, Sarah had driven back from the grocery store and parked her silver SUV in the garage. In her hurry to tend to Emma, who had started fussing, she forgot to close the outer garage door completely. The door hung open just enough for a curious forest visitor to investigate the unfamiliar space. Emma's father, Daniel Marshall, had left early for his shift at the local ranger station. "I'll be back before dinner," he had promised, kissing both his girls goodbye. Little did he know that this ordinary Tuesday would soon turn into something extraordinary. As Sarah moved around the kitchen, preparing Emma's favorite oatmeal with tiny pieces of banana, she heard a strange sound coming from the garage. At first, she dismissed it as the house settling, or perhaps the wind pushing against the partially open garage door. The sound came again. A soft scraping followed by what seemed like heavy breathing. "Must be that stray cat again," Sarah murmured to herself, making a mental note to check later. She placed Emma's breakfast in a colorful bowl shaped like a bear, ironically foreshadowing what was about to unfold in their lives. Emma babbled happily on her playmat, unaware of the unexpected visitor that had wandered into their garage, drawn by the lingering scent of the breakfast muffins Sarah had brought home. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath as one of its most formidable residents ventured into the human world. In the garage, attracted by unfamiliar smells and curious about this strange cave-like structure, a large mother bear had cautiously entered through the partially open door. Her thick brown fur glistened in the dim light as she sniffed around, eventually approaching the family's SUV. The vehicle's door had not fully latched when Sarah unloaded groceries, and with a nudge of her powerful nose, the bear managed to push it open just enough to investigate further. The mother bear, driven by hunger after a long winter, climbed into the vehicle, seeking the source of the enticing food smells. The car door, caught by a sudden gust of wind, swung shut behind her with a soft click that went unnoticed by anyone, except the now trapped bear. Sarah placed Emma in her high chair and turned on a cheerful morning cartoon on the small kitchen television. The colorful animals dancing across the screen captivated Emma, giving Sarah a moment to enjoy her own breakfast. The peaceful morning routine continued until the sounds from the garage grew louder, more insistent. A low, rumbling growl, followed by the distinctive sound of something heavy shifting against metal, finally caught Sarah's full attention. She froze, a spoonful of yogurt halfway to her mouth. That was definitely not a stray cat. "What on earth?" Sarah whispered, setting down her spoon. She moved cautiously toward the garage door, pressing her ear against it. The sounds continued, scratching, a heavy thud, then a distressed whine that sent chills down her spine. Whatever was in there was large and increasingly agitated. Sarah backed away from the door, her heart pounding. She rushed to grab her phone from the counter and dialed Daniel's number with trembling fingers. "Dan, there's something in the garage," she whispered urgently when he answered. "Something big. I think it might be a bear." "A bear? Are you sure?" Daniel's voice crackled through the phone, concern evident even through the poor connection. "Where's Emma?" "She's right here with me in the kitchen," Sarah assured him, glancing at their daughter who was happily smashing banana pieces on her tray, oblivious to her mother's distress. "Listen to me carefully," Daniel instructed. "Take Emma and go to the bedroom at the back of the house. Lock the door and stay there. I'm calling animal control and heading home now." Sarah agreed and hung up. She quickly lifted Emma from her high chair, causing the baby to protest with an unhappy whimper. "Shh, it's okay, sweetie," Sarah soothed, though her own voice quavered with fear. She grabbed Emma's favorite stuffed rabbit from the living room and hurried down the hallway. Just as they reached the bedroom, a loud crash came from the garage, followed by an unmistakable roar. The sound startled Sarah so badly that she nearly dropped her phone. Emma, sensing her mother's fear, began to cry in earnest. Inside the garage, the mother bear was growing increasingly desperate. When she had first entered the SUV, she had discovered a forgotten bag of muffins in the back seat and devoured them quickly. But satisfaction had turned to panic when she realized she couldn't get back out. The car's interior was becoming stifling, and the bear's natural instinct to flee was thwarted by the closed doors and windows. In her panic, the bear had pressed against the car horn, creating a sustained blaring that now mixed with her distressed growls. The combination of sounds was terrifying, echoing through the house and causing Sarah to clutch Emma tighter as they huddled on the bed. "It's okay, sweetie, Daddy's coming," Sarah whispered, rocking Emma gently. But the baby continued to cry, her face red with distress as the jarring sounds from the garage persisted. 20 minutes passed like an eternity as Sarah and Emma waited in the bedroom. The sounds from the garage had changed. The horn had stopped, but the scratching and thumping continued intermittently, punctuated by what Sarah could only describe as desperate whimpers. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Animal control 30 minutes away. I'm 10 minutes out. Stay put." Relief washed over her. Help was coming. But Emma had grown restless and squirmy in her arms, her cries reduced to occasional sniffles as curiosity began to replace fear. The baby seemed drawn to the strange sounds, turning her head toward the bedroom door whenever a particularly loud thump came from the garage. "No, Emma, we have to stay here," Sarah murmured, trying to distract her daughter with the stuffed rabbit. But Emma was at that age where restraint was a foreign concept, and sitting still with her anxious mother was becoming unbearable. Sarah's phone rang again, Daniel calling for an update. As she reached to answer, Emma saw her opportunity. With surprising speed for a baby who had only recently mastered crawling, Emma wriggled from her mother's loosened grip and scooted toward the bedroom door. "Emma, no!" Sarah gasped, lunging forward. But, in her haste to answer the phone and grab Emma simultaneously, she knocked over a glass of water on the nightstand. The phone clattered to the floor, and Emma, startled by the noise, accelerated her escape. Before Sarah could recover, Emma had pushed against the door, which hadn't properly latched, and disappeared into the hallway. "Daniel, Emma's gotten out. I have to go after her." Sarah cried into the phone, not waiting for a response before scrambling after her daughter. But Emma, motivated by curiosity and the freedom of escape, was moving with astonishing speed, her little hands and knees working in perfect synchrony down the hallway toward the source of the interesting sounds. Sarah emerged from the bedroom just in time to see Emma disappear around the corner into the kitchen. "Emma, stop!" she called, her voice tight with panic as she ran after her daughter. When Sarah reached the kitchen, her heart nearly stopped. The door to the garage stood open, and Emma was nowhere in sight. Inside the garage, the mother bear had exhausted herself trying to escape from the SUV. The vehicle's interior was stifling, and the bear's fur was damp with sweat. Her powerful claws had torn into the leather seats, and the dashboard bore the marks of her desperate attempts to find a way out. But the doors remained stubbornly closed, the windows too tough to break with just her paws. The bear's life force seemed to be draining away in the increasingly hot, airless space. Her movements had become sluggish, her once fearsome roars reduced to pitiful whines. Through the car windows, her dark eyes reflected a primal fear, the terror of dying, trapped and alone. And then, impossibly, the garage's interior door opened wider, and a tiny human figure appeared in the doorway. Emma crawled into the garage, her curiosity completely overriding any sense of danger. The dim space was filled with unfamiliar shadows and strange smells, but the baby was drawn forward by the soft, distressed sounds coming from her mother's car. Sarah appeared in the doorway seconds later, her face a mask of pure terror. "Emma!" she gasped, too afraid to shout. The scene before her was a mother's worst nightmare. Her baby daughter just feet away from a car containing a trapped and desperate wild animal. But something strange was happening. The bear, seeing the small human, had gone completely still. Through the car window, her dark eyes followed Emma's movements with what almost looked like hope. Emma, oblivious to the danger, continued her determined journey across the concrete floor until she reached the car. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, torn between rushing to grab her daughter and fearing that any sudden movement might provoke the bear into a final, desperate surge of energy. "Emma," Sarah whispered, slowly dropping to a crouch. "Come to Mommy, please." But Emma was focused entirely on the car and its occupant. She pulled herself up to standing, using the car door as support, her small fingers leaving smudges on the shiny surface as she peered curiously through the window. The bear and the baby locked eyes in a surreal moment of connection. The massive creature, her breath fogging the window, made a soft huffing sound that was not threatening, but almost seemed pleading. Emma babbled in response, placing her tiny palm flat against the glass. Sarah, her maternal instinct finally overwhelming her fear, began to inch forward. "Emma, don't move," she whispered, her eyes darting between her daughter and the bear. Then, something extraordinary happened. As Emma stood wobbling beside the driver's door, her hand slipped down to the handle, the same handle that had been just out of the bear's reach from the inside. The baby's natural tendency to grab and pull at everything within reach led her to tug at the shiny lever. The car door opened with a soft click. Sarah's scream caught in her throat as time seemed to freeze. The bear, sensing freedom, shifted her massive weight toward the opening. Emma, still holding the door handle, tumbled backward onto her padded bottom as the door swung wider. Sarah lunged forward in desperation, certain she was about to witness her worst nightmare. But instead of charging out in a frenzy, the mother bear moved with careful deliberation. She emerged from the car slowly, her eyes never leaving the small human who had inadvertently freed her. Emma sat on the garage floor, looking up at the enormous creature now standing just feet away. Instead of crying or showing fear, she let out a delighted giggle and clapped her hands. The garage fell into a strange, suspended silence. Sarah stood halfway between the door and her daughter, her body tense and ready to throw herself between Emma and the bear, regardless of the consequences. But the expected attack never came. The mother bear, free from her metal prison, stood shakily on all fours, her massive head lowered as she took in deep breaths of fresh air. Her dark eyes moved from Emma to Sarah, then to the partially open garage door that led to the forest and freedom. For what seemed like an eternity but was probably only seconds, the bear remained motionless, her gaze returning to the small human who had unwittingly saved her life. Emma, still sitting on the floor, reached out one chubby hand toward the magnificent creature as if offering friendship. "Emma, don't move," Sarah breathed, hardly daring to blink. Every muscle in her body was coiled to spring forward and grab her daughter, but something in the bear's demeanor held her back. There was no aggression in the animal's posture, only exhaustion and what appeared almost like gratitude. The bear lowered her head further, her nose almost touching the garage floor. She inhaled deeply, taking in Emma's scent. The baby, fearless in her innocence, giggled again and babbled something in her private language. And then, with a gentleness that defied her wild nature, the mother bear moved past Emma, giving the child a wide berth. She padded softly toward the garage door, her gait unsteady from her ordeal, but her intention clear. Sarah remained frozen, afraid that any movement might break the spell and trigger the bear's predatory instincts. Emma, however, had no such concerns. She twisted around to watch the bear leave, waving her small hand as if saying goodbye to a friend. At the garage entrance, the mother bear paused. She turned her great head back toward Emma and Sarah, her eyes seeming to hold a message that transcended the barriers between their species. Then, with a soft huff that stirred the dust on the garage floor, she slipped out into the sunlight and disappeared into the trees beyond. Only when the bear was completely out of sight did Sarah dart forward and scoop Emma into her arms, her body shaking with residual fear and overwhelming relief. She clutched her daughter tight, tears streaming down her face as she backed away from the garage door. "You crazy, brave, wonderful girl," she whispered into Emma's hair. "What did you do? What did you just do?" Emma squirmed in her mother's grip, pointing toward the now empty garage with a smile. "Bear," she said clearly, her first recognizable word. Daniel Marshall arrived home 3 minutes later, tires screeching as he pulled into the driveway. He leaped from his truck and ran toward the house, his ranger's uniform dusty from his hasty departure from work. Behind him, a vehicle from animal control followed more sedately. He burst through the front door, calling out frantically, "Sarah? Emma?" "We're here," Sarah's voice replied from the kitchen. "We're okay." Daniel rushed to find his wife and daughter seated at the kitchen table. Emma was happily munching on pieces of banana as if nothing extraordinary had happened, while Sarah sat beside her, one hand constantly touching the baby, as if to reassure herself that Emma was truly safe. "What happened? Where's the bear?" Daniel demanded, dropping to his knees beside them and pulling them both into a tight embrace. "Gone," Sarah said, her voice still shaky. "Back to the forest, and you won't believe how—" As the animal control officers entered cautiously, armed with tranquilizer guns and capture equipment, Sarah recounted the incredible story. How Emma had escaped, how she had opened the car door, and how the mother bear had shown what could only be described as mercy, or perhaps gratitude, before peacefully leaving. The animal control officers exchanged skeptical glances as they examined the garage and the damaged interior of the SUV. "Ma'am, that's not typically how bear encounters go," one officer said gently, as if speaking to someone in shock. "You and your daughter are extremely lucky to be unharmed." "I know what I saw," Sarah insisted, holding Emma closer. "She could have attacked us both, but she didn't. It was almost like she knew Emma had helped her." Daniel, after inspecting the car and the clear bear tracks leading away from the garage, returned to the kitchen with a troubled expression. "The bear was definitely trapped in there," he confirmed, "and from the tracks she headed straight back into the deep forest, away from other homes. It's almost like she just wanted to get away." That evening, as news of the incident spread through their small community, neighbors stopped by with casseroles and concerned questions. The local wildlife officer arrived to take a report, advising the marshals on better securing their home against future wildlife intrusions. Bears are opportunistic, but not usually this bold, he explained, examining the partly torn seat of the SUV. She must have been really hungry to come so close to humans. As darkness fell and the visitors departed, the Marshall family settled into an uneasy calm. Emma, exhausted from the excitement, fell asleep quickly in her crib, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Sarah and Daniel sat on their back porch, looking out at the darkening forest where their unusual visitor had disappeared. "I keep thinking about how it could have ended," Sarah whispered, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "But also about what actually happened. The way that bear looked at Emma, I'll never forget it." 3 days passed, and life began to return to normal for the Marshall family. Daniel reinforced the garage door and installed motion sensor lights around the property. Sarah became vigilant about keeping all doors securely closed and food scents contained. Emma, blissfully unaware of how close she had come to danger, continued her daily explorations and play. On Saturday morning, as the family ate breakfast on their back deck, enjoying the warm spring sunshine, Emma suddenly pointed toward the tree line and said clearly, "Bear, bear." Daniel and Sarah exchanged alarmed glances. "She's been saying that since the incident," Sarah explained. "I think it made quite an impression." But Emma continued pointing and growing more insistent. "Bear, bear." Daniel stood slowly and moved to the deck railing, scanning the forest edge. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the usual movement of branches in the breeze and the occasional darting of small forest creatures. Then, he caught a glimpse of something brown moving slowly between 2 large pine trees. He tensed, reaching back to motion Sarah and Emma inside. "Wait," Sarah said, moving to stand beside him. "Look." At the forest's edge, partially concealed behind a fallen log, stood the mother bear. She was instantly recognizable by a distinctive patch of lighter fur on her shoulder. But she wasn't alone. 2 small bear cubs tumbled playfully around her paws, their brown bodies almost invisible against the forest floor. "She has babies," Sarah breathed, understanding washing over her. "That's why she was so desperate to escape. They needed her." As if hearing Sarah's words, the mother bear rose onto her hind legs, her powerful form silhouetted against the trees. For a long moment, she stood watching the human family on their deck, her cubs now quiet at her feet. Emma wriggled in Sarah's arms, pointing excitedly. "Bear, baby bears." The mother bear dropped back to all fours and nudged her cubs gently. Then, with a deliberate movement that seemed impossible to misinterpret, she looked directly at the marshals, at Emma specifically, before turning and leading her cubs deeper into the forest, disappearing from sight. "Did that just happen?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with wonder. "Did she just show us her cubs, like she was introducing them?" Sarah nodded slowly, too moved to speak immediately. When she finally found her voice, she said, "I think she wanted us to know she's okay. That they're okay." As they stood together in the morning sunshine, a powerful sense of connection washed over the Marshall family. A reminder that the barriers between human and animal worlds were perhaps more permeable than they had ever imagined, and that compassion could transcend even the most fundamental differences. "Bear family," Emma said softly, waving her small hand toward the now empty forest edge. "Bye-bye." In that moment, on that ordinary spring morning, made extraordinary by an encounter that defied explanation, the Marshalls knew they had been given a rare gift. A glimpse into a world where understanding flowed between species, and where a baby's innocent action had not only saved a life, but created a bond that would never be forgotten. Word of the incredible bear encounter spread quickly through the small woodland community. At first, Many dismissed it as an exaggeration, a frightened mother's embellished account of a close call. But Daniel's position as a respected forest ranger lent credibility to the story, and the damaged car provided tangible evidence that something extraordinary had indeed occurred. Local news caught wind of the story a week later. "Baby saves bear. Incredible wildlife encounter defies explanation," read the headline in the Pine Ridge Gazette. The reporter interviewed the marshals on their front porch. Emma balanced on Sarah's hip as cameras captured her innocent smile. "We're not suggesting that people should interact with wildlife," Daniel emphasized during the interview. "What happened was dangerous and could have ended very differently. We were incredibly lucky." "But there was something special about that moment," Sarah added, her eyes drifting toward the forest. "Something that went beyond luck. It felt like understanding." The story might have remained a local curiosity, but in the age of social media, such extraordinary tales rarely stay contained. A wildlife photographer passing through the area approached the marshals, asking permission to set up a blind near their property in hopes of capturing images of the mother bear and her cubs. "There's something powerful about this story," he explained. "In a world where human-wildlife conflicts so often end tragically, people need to hear about the exceptions." The marshals agreed with one condition: that any photographs would be used to support local conservation efforts. Daniel, whose work already centered on protecting the forest and its inhabitants, saw an opportunity to transform their frightening experience into something beneficial for the wilderness they had chosen to call home. As spring turned to early summer, the wildlife photographer's patience was rewarded. From his carefully positioned blind, he captured a series of remarkable images. The mother bear guiding her cubs through a sun-dappled clearing, teaching them to forage for berries, standing guard while they played in a shallow stream. But the photograph that captured hearts across the country showed the mother bear standing at the edge of the clearing near the Marshall home, her cubs beside her, all three looking toward the house with what appeared to be calm curiosity rather than fear or aggression. When the images were published alongside the marshal's story in a national nature magazine, the response was overwhelming. Conservation organizations reached out, seeking to collaborate on educational programs. Wildlife researchers contacted Daniel, interested in studying the unusual behavior displayed by the mother bear. "In 30 years of bear research, I've documented countless human-bear interactions," wrote Dr. Eleanor Jenkins, a renowned wildlife biologist. "What you've described, and what these photographs suggest, represents an anomaly worth investigating." For the marshals, the attention was both surprising and meaningful. At Daniel's suggestion, they established a small foundation dedicated to promoting peaceful coexistence between humans and wildlife in areas where their habitats overlapped. "The Emma Marshall Wildlife Trust," Sarah suggested, watching as their daughter, now toddling confidently, pointed out pictures of her bears in the Nature magazine. "Perfect," Daniel agreed, because sometimes it takes a child's innocent perspective to remind us that compassion knows no species. Throughout that summer, visitors to the Pine Ridge trails occasionally reported sightings of a mother bear with 2 cubs. Unlike other bears that fled at the first sign of human presence, this particular family often paused at a safe distance, observing hikers with what rangers described as unusual tolerance. Park officials, aware of the marshal's experience, posted special notices along trails frequented by the bear family. Respectful distance required. These bears have shown non-aggressive behavior, but remain wild animals deserving of space and respect. Emma, growing more verbal with each passing week, developed a special interest in all things bear-related. Her stuffed rabbit was replaced by a plush bear that she carried everywhere, often stopping to show it the real bears in the nature magazine. "Your bear," she would say solemnly, pointing to the mother bear's photograph. "Emma's friend." As autumn painted the forest in shades of gold and crimson, the sightings of the mother bear and her growing cubs became less frequent. Wildlife experts explained that the family was likely preparing for winter, foraging more deeply in the forest for the nutrition they would need during hibernation. On a crisp October morning, Daniel spotted fresh bear tracks in the light dusting of early snow near their home. The tracks led to a small clearing visible from their back deck, where 3 distinct impressions marked the ground, one large and 2 smaller, as if the bears had paused there deliberately. That evening, as twilight settled over the forest, the Marshall family stood together on their deck. Emma, bundled in a puffy coat against the autumn chill, scanned the darkening trees with expectant eyes. "Bear sleeping soon," she announced with the certainty only a child could possess. "Long sleep." Sarah and Daniel exchanged surprised glances, wondering how their daughter seemed to understand the concept of hibernation without being taught. "That's right, sweetie," Sarah said, pulling Emma closer. "The bears need to sleep through the winter so they can be strong when spring comes." As if in response to their conversation, a movement at the forest edge caught their attention. There, in the gathering dusk, 3 shadows moved between the trees. The mother bear and her cubs, now noticeably larger than when last seen. The bear family paused at the clearing's edge. The mother bear rose briefly to her hind legs, her silhouette unmistakable against the twilight sky. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, she gazed toward the human family on their deck. "Bye-bye, bears," Emma called softly, waving her small hand. "See you next spring." The mother bear dropped back to all fours and gathered her cubs with gentle nudges. Then, with one last glance toward the house, she led her family deeper into the forest, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Daniel wrapped his arms around Sarah and Emma, drawing them close as they watched the empty space where the bears had stood. No words were needed to express what they all felt, the profound sense of having been part of something rare and beautiful, a bridge between worlds that so rarely connect in peace. As stars began to appear in the clear autumn sky, the Marshall family turned toward the warmth of their home, carrying with them the memory of an extraordinary encounter and the lasting lesson it had taught them, that sometimes the smallest actions, a baby's innocent curiosity, a wild mother's restraint, could create moments of grace that transcended the natural order and reminded all creatures of their shared place in the world's vast, interconnected heart. The first major snowfall transformed the forest into a crystalline wonderland 2 weeks before Christmas. Emma, now 14 months old, pressed her nose against the living room window, watching snowflakes dance in the December wind. Her vocabulary had expanded significantly, but bear remained one of her favorite words, much to the amusement of family visitors who hadn't witnessed the summer's extraordinary events. "She's obsessed with bears," Sarah explained to her mother, who had come to stay for the holidays. "Ever since—" A sudden power outage interrupted her words, plunging the house into darkness as the howling wind outside intensified. "Perfect timing," Daniel sighed, reaching for the emergency flashlight they kept on a shelf. "The weather service warned this might happen. I'll get the generator started." As Daniel struggled to start the backup generator in the worsening storm, Sarah lit candles and built up the fire in the living room hearth. Emma seemed unfazed by the darkness, continuing to peer out the window at the swirling snow. Night fell early, the darkness absolute without electricity. The temperature in the house began to drop despite the crackling fire. After several failed attempts, Daniel returned from the garage with frost-dusted hair and a troubled expression. "Generator's frozen up," he announced, And the phone lines are down, cell service too. Sarah's mother, Eleanor, pulled Emma onto her lap, wrapping them both in a thick quilt. "Reminds me of the blizzard of '89, she remarked. "Your father and I were trapped for 3 days. Daniel checked his watch. "If the roads are passable in the morning, I'll try to reach the ranger station. They'll have a working radio at least." As the family huddled close to the fire, sharing stories to pass the time and keep their spirits up, Emma suddenly squirmed free of the quilt and pointed urgently toward the window. "Bear! Bear coming!" she insisted, her small face serious in the firelight. "Honey, the bears are hibernating now," Sarah explained gently. "Remember, we talked about their long winter sleep." But Emma was adamant, tugging at Daniel's hand. "Bear, Daddy, look!" Daniel, indulging his daughter, moved to the frost-covered window and wiped a clear spot with his sleeve. The security lights that normally illuminated their property were dark, but the full moon reflecting off the snow provided enough light to see the yard and forest edge. At first, he saw nothing but snow and shadows. Then, a large, dark shape moved against the whiteness. Daniel tensed, squinting to make out details. "Sarah," he called quietly, "bring me the binoculars." Sarah retrieved the binoculars from a drawer, passing them to Daniel with a questioning look. He focused them carefully, adjusting for the darkness. "It can't be," he murmured. "What? What is it?" Sarah asked, moving to stand beside him. "It's her," Daniel said, his voice filled with disbelief. "The mother bear. She's out in the middle of winter." "That's impossible," Eleanor declared from her place by the fire. "Bears don't break hibernation unless something's terribly wrong." Daniel passed the binoculars to Sarah, who confirmed his sighting with a gasp. The mother bear was unmistakable, moving slowly through the deep snow toward their home. But something was different. "Where are the cubs?" Sarah asked, scanning the tree line. As if in answer, the bear stopped at the edge of their yard and let out a low, mournful sound that carried clearly through the frigid air. She pawed at the snow, then looked directly toward the house. Emma, who had been watching the adults' reactions with solemn attention, suddenly declared, "Bear sad, bear needs help." Daniel and Sarah exchanged worried glances. Bears did not leave hibernation in the middle of winter without dire cause. Something was very wrong. "We should call the Wildlife Service," Sarah began, then remembered. "The phones." Daniel made a decision. "I'm going to check, just to make sure she's okay." "Are you insane?" Eleanor protested. "It's below freezing out there, and that's a wild animal." But Daniel was already pulling on his heavy coat and boots. "She came to us for a reason," he said simply. "After what happened this summer, I can't ignore that." Sarah, torn between concern for her husband and a strange sense that Emma was right, that the bear somehow needed their help, finally nodded. "Be careful," she whispered, pressing a walkie-talkie into Daniel's hand. "I'll watch from here with the rifle, just in case." Daniel stepped out into the bitter cold, snow crunching under his boots. The bear remained at the yard's edge, watching him with what appeared to be nervous anticipation rather than aggression. As Daniel approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones, the bear made no move to flee or charge. When he was about 30 feet away, the bear turned and took a few steps toward the forest, then looked back at Daniel, as if asking him to follow. Inside the house, Sarah watched through the binoculars with her heart in her throat. "She wants him to go with her," she murmured in disbelief. "Bear needs help," Emma repeated confidently, pressing her small hands against the window. Daniel, seemingly reaching the same conclusion, keyed the walkie-talkie. "I think she wants me to follow her. I'm going to see where she leads." "Daniel, No, Sarah protested into the walkie-talkie. It's too dangerous in this storm. But Daniel was already following the bear, who moved with purpose toward the forest. I won't go far, he promised, but I need to know what's wrong. The radio crackled with interference as Daniel disappeared into the trees, following the dark shape of the mother bear. Sarah stood frozen by the window, the binoculars pressed to her eyes, until both Daniel and the bear vanished from sight. Minutes stretched into an agonizing half-hour with no word from Daniel. Sarah paced the living room, alternating between trying the walkie-talkie and peering anxiously out the window. Eleanor kept Emma occupied by the fire, though the child seemed unnaturally calm, as if she understood something the adults did not. Finally, the walkie-talkie crackled to life. "Sarah?" Daniel's voice was breathless, urgent. "I need you to prepare the mudroom, clear everything out. Make a space with blankets as warm as you can get it." "Daniel?" "What's happening? Are you all right?" Sarah demanded. "I'm fine, but I need your help. The cubs, they're in trouble. One of them is injured, and their den has collapsed in the storm. They're freezing. I'm bringing them back." Sarah nearly dropped the walkie-talkie in shock. "You're bringing wild bear cubs to our house? Daniel, think about what you're saying." "There's no choice," Daniel replied, his voice breaking up through the static. "They'll die out here. The mother led me straight to them. She knew we could help, Sarah. Somehow, she knew." As the reality of the situation sank in, Sarah found herself moving automatically, clearing the mudroom as Daniel had asked. She laid down thick blankets and placed portable heaters to warm the small space, her mind racing with the impossibility of what was happening. Emma watched solemnly from the doorway, clutching her bear toy. "Bear baby's coming," she announced, as if this extraordinary turn of events was the most natural thing in the world. 45 minutes later, the back door burst open, bringing a swirl of snow and biting wind. Daniel appeared, snow-covered and red-faced from exertion, carrying a large bundle wrapped in his coat. Behind him, impossibly, came the mother bear, moving cautiously but with clear purpose. "Don't be afraid," Daniel gasped as Eleanor let out a terrified shriek. "She's not going to hurt anyone. She's just following her cubs." In the bundle Daniel carried, 2 bear cubs were huddled together, their fur wet and matted with snow. One was obviously injured, blood staining the smaller cub's hind leg. "The den collapsed in the storm," Daniel explained as he gently placed the cubs on the blankets in the mudroom. "A fallen branch injured this one. They were half buried in snow when she led me to them." The mother bear stood in the doorway, watching with anxious eyes as Daniel tended to her young. She made no aggressive moves, though her massive presence filled the small room with primal power. "This is insane," Eleanor whispered, pulling Emma behind her protectively. "We need to call for help." "There is no help," Sarah replied, her voice steady as she moved to Daniel's side with the first aid kit. "Not tonight, not in this storm. We're all they have." As the Marshall family worked to warm and treat the bear cubs, the mother bear settled herself at the mudroom door, her eyes never leaving her young. Emma, slipping free of her grandmother's grip, approached the massive creature with the same fearless innocence she had shown months before. "Bear came home," she said, stopping just beyond arm's reach of the mother. "Emma, help bear babies." The mother bear turned her great head toward the child, their eyes meeting in that same mysterious connection that had formed in the garage. For a heartbeat, the human world and wild world seemed to merge, linked by a thread of understanding that defied explanation. And in that moment, as snow piled against the windows and wind howled through the darkness, the Marshalls' home became a sanctuary for creatures who should have been their natural enemies, but who had, through one small miracle and now another, become something else entirely. Not quite friends, but no longer strangers. The power remained out, but the house was far from cold that night, warmed by an unexpected kind of magic, the magic of barriers broken and trust given against all odds. The storm raged throughout the night, transforming the forest into an impenetrable wall of white. Inside the Marshall home, illuminated only by firelight and candles, an extraordinary vigil took place. Daniel, drawing on his ranger training and frantically skimming a wildlife first aid manual by flashlight, worked to treat the injured cub's leg. A jagged branch had pierced the young bear's thigh, leaving a deep wound that, while not life-threatening if properly treated, could easily become infected. "I need to clean this and get the splinters out," he muttered, examining the injury carefully. "But I've never treated a bear before." Sarah knelt beside him, supplies spread on a clean towel. "What about that workshop you took last spring?" "Wildlife emergency care?" "That was mostly for deer and smaller animals," Daniel replied, but his hands moved with growing confidence as he recalled the training. "But the principles should be similar. Keep the wound clean, remove foreign objects, prevent infection." The mother bear watched every movement from her position at the mudroom entrance, her massive body blocking the doorway. Her dark eyes followed Daniel's hands with intense focus, but she made no move to interfere. It was as if she understood that this human, despite his clumsiness compared to a bear's natural grace, was trying to help her young. The uninjured cub had curled into a tight ball in the corner of the blanket nest, occasionally whimpering but apparently drawing comfort from its mother's presence. The injured cub, however, put up a fight when Daniel attempted to clean the wound, snapping weakly with tiny but sharp teeth. "I can't hold him still enough," Daniel said in frustration after several attempts. "He's too scared." In a moment that would later seem dreamlike in its strangeness, the mother bear rose and moved forward. Daniel and Sarah froze, uncertain of her intentions. But instead of displaying aggression, the bear gently nosed her injured cub, making soft huffing sounds that seemed to calm the little one. Then, in a gesture that left the human speechless, she placed one heavy paw carefully on the cub's uninjured side, effectively holding it still while looking directly at Daniel. "She wants you to continue," Sarah whispered, hardly believing what she was seeing. Working with renewed focus, Daniel cleaned the wound, removed several splinters of wood, and applied antibiotic ointment. The injured cub whimpered but remained relatively still under its mother's restraining paw. When Daniel finally wrapped the leg with a light bandage, the mother bear moved back, allowing the injured cub to crawl to its sibling for comfort. "I've done all I can," Daniel said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill in the air. "Now we wait and see." Through the night, the family took turns watching over their unusual guests. Eleanor, who had initially been terrified, gradually moved from fear to cautious wonder as she observed the mother bear's obvious intelligence and restraint. "In 50 years of living near these woods, I've never heard of anything like this," she admitted to Sarah as they huddled by the fire during their watch. "Bears are supposed to be dangerous, unpredictable." Sarah watched as Emma slept peacefully on the sofa, her bear toy clutched to her chest. "I think we've been wrong about a lot of things," she said softly, "or at least we haven't been seeing the whole picture." Around 3 a.m, Daniel, who had been dozing in a chair, was awakened by a soft nudge against his knee. He opened his eyes to find the mother bear standing over him, making urgent sounds deep in her throat. Fully alert instantly, Daniel followed the bear to the mudroom, where he found the injured cub shivering violently despite the blankets and heaters. The cub's breathing was labored, its small body rigid with what appeared to be fever. "Sarah," Daniel called, his voice tight with concern. "I need the first aid kit again, and any antibiotics we have in the house." For the next 2 hours, Daniel and Sarah worked desperately to save the cub, whose condition was deteriorating rapidly. The wound had become infected despite their care, and the little bear's system was struggling to fight back. "We need a vet," Daniel said finally, his voice heavy with defeat. "There's not enough we can do." The storm outside had not abated, making any attempt to reach help impossible. As dawn approached, a gray light filtering through the snow-covered windows, the injured cub grew weaker, its breathing shallow and irregular. The mother bear, sensing her young one's peril, moved restlessly between the mudroom and the living room, as if searching for something or someone who could help. Finally, she approached Emma, who had awakened and was sitting quietly on the sofa, watching the adults' desperate efforts. "Bear," Emma said simply, reaching out a small hand that stopped just short of touching the massive creature's fur. The mother bear made a soft, keening sound that seemed to vibrate with distress. Emma tilted her head, as if listening to words only she could hear. Then, with purpose that startled the adults, she slid from the sofa and toddled toward the kitchen. "Emma, come back here," Sarah called anxiously. But the child continued with determination, the mother bear following close behind. In the kitchen, illuminated only by a single candle, Emma reached toward a high cabinet, pointing insistently. "Medicine," she said clearly. "Bear medicine." Daniel and Sarah exchanged bewildered glances. Then Daniel moved to open the cabinet. Inside was their collection of herbal remedies, tinctures and dried plants that Sarah had learned to use from an elderly neighbor who practiced traditional medicine. "What am I looking for?" Daniel asked, not expecting a coherent answer from his toddler daughter. But Emma pointed directly to a dark bottle labeled echinacea and golden seal tincture, and a small jar of honey. "This one," she said confidently, "and honey for Bear." Daniel took down the items, baffled but willing to try anything. "These are immune boosters," Sarah explained, examining the tincture. "And honey has natural antibacterial properties. But I don't know if they're safe for bears." "Bear medicine," Emma insisted, now tugging at a drawer that contained clean droppers and syringes they used for measuring children's medication. The mother bear watched this exchange with focused attention, then made a decisive movement back toward the mudroom where her cubs waited. Her message seemed clear. Hurry. With no other options and the injured cub failing quickly, Daniel prepared a mixture of the tincture diluted with water and sweet honey. Using a small syringe without a needle, he carefully administered the mixture into the side of the cub's mouth, as he had seen veterinarians do with injured wildlife. "Now we wait," he said, his voice reflecting the slim hope he held for success. As the gray dawn brightened toward morning, the family gathered in the mudroom, watching over the bear family in a vigil that transcended the normal boundaries between human and wild. Emma sat closest to the mother bear, separated by just a few feet, occasionally murmuring words that sounded like nonsense to the adults, but seemed to hold the mother bear's attention. Around mid-morning, when the storm had finally begun to subside, the injured cub stirred, making stronger movements than it had for hours. Its breathing deepened and steadied, and when Daniel carefully checked, the cub's temperature seemed to have dropped from its dangerous high. "I don't believe it," he whispered. "The infection might be breaking." The mother bear, who had remained vigilant throughout the night, made a soft huffing sound that almost seemed like a sigh of relief. She gently nosed her injured cub, who responded with a weak but definite movement toward her warmth. By noon, with sunlight finally breaking through the clouds and snow, the power flickered back to life throughout the house. The phones remained down, but the immediate crisis seemed to have passed. The injured cub was awake, taking small amounts of water and showing interest in its surroundings. Daniel made his way outside to clear a path to their vehicle, hoping to reach help now that the storm had passed. The mother bear, after checking on both her cubs, followed him to the door and stood watching his progress through the deep snow. Sarah, observing this scene from the window, was struck by how ordinary it had begun to seem, this wild creature moving through their home with intent and intelligence, communicating in ways they were only beginning to understand. "How is any of this possible?" Eleanor asked, standing beside her daughter at the window. "Bears don't behave this way with humans. They just don't." Sarah watched as Emma, secure in the knowledge that only a child could possess, reached out to gently touch the soft fur of the uninjured cub, who accepted the contact with curiosity rather than fear. "Maybe they do," Sarah replied softly. "Maybe they always could, and we just never gave them the chance to show us." By early afternoon, Daniel had managed to clear enough snow to get his truck out. The rural roads remained treacherous, but as a forest ranger he had experience driving in extreme conditions. Before leaving to seek professional help for the injured cub, he made a call on the newly restored phone line to Dr. Eliza Thornton, a wildlife veterinarian who occasionally consulted with the Forestry Service. "You have a what in your house?" Dr. Thornton's voice crackled over the line, disbelief evident even through the poor connection. "A mother bear and 2 cubs," Daniel repeated patiently. "One cub is injured. We've done what we can, but he needs professional care." There was a long pause before Dr. Thornton spoke again. "Daniel, if this is some kind of joke—" "It's not," Daniel interrupted. "Eliza, it's the same bear from this summer, the one Emma freed from our car. She came back during the storm because her cubs were in trouble. She led me to them." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll be there in an hour, Doctor," Thornton said finally. "And I'm bringing James Wilson from Wildlife Services. He needs to document this." Word spread quickly through the small network of forestry and wildlife professionals. By the time Dr. Thornton arrived with her colleague, 3 other vehicles had pulled up in front of the Marshall home. A local news reporter who had connections at the ranger station, Dr. Jenkins, the wildlife biologist who had corresponded with the Marshalls previously, and a representative from the state's Environmental Protection Office. "This wasn't exactly what I had in mind," Daniel said apologetically to Sarah as they watched the small crowd gathering outside. "I just wanted help for the cub." Sarah squeezed his hand. "It's too extraordinary to stay private, Daniel. We always knew that." When Dr. Thornton entered the mudroom, her professional demeanor momentarily cracked at the sight of the mother bear sitting calmly beside her cubs, with Emma nearby sorting through her toy animals as if this were the most natural situation in the world. "Incredible," the veterinarian breathed, then quickly gathered her composure. "I need to examine the cub. Will she let me?" Daniel nodded, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "She's been letting us help. Just move slowly and talk softly." What followed was a careful dance of human medical intervention and wild animal trust. The mother bear watched with intense focus as Dr. Thornton examined her injured cub, only occasionally making soft sounds of concern when the cub whimpered, "The wound is infected, but your treatment helped significantly," Dr. Thornton confirmed after her examination. "With proper antibiotics and care, he should recover completely." James Wilson, the wildlife officer, had been documenting the scene with photographs and careful notes. "This defies everything we know about black bear behavior," he said, his voice low with amazement. "Particularly a mother with cubs. She should be attacking us for being this close to her young." "Bear knows," Emma said simply, looking up from her toys. "Bear remembers Emma helped." The adults exchanged glances, struck once again by the child's uncanny connection to the situation. Dr. Jenkins, who had been observing silently, knelt beside Emma. "What does the bear know, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Emma tilted her head, considering the question with serious concentration. "Bear knows we're friends," she said finally. "Bear says thank you." Dr. Jenkins wrote down the child's words, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Interspecies recognition and reciprocity," she murmured. "It's been documented in dolphins, primates, even some birds, but rarely so clearly in large predators with humans." As the afternoon progressed, the mother bear remained calm despite the increasing number of strangers in the house. She accepted the veterinarian's treatment of her cub with what could only be described as patience, occasionally sniffing the medical supplies with cautious curiosity. The local reporter, initially skeptical despite having covered the summer's story, was now frantically taking notes and photographs. "This is going national," she declared. "Maybe international. A wild mother bear seeking human help for her cubs, remembering a past encounter with a specific family. This is unprecedented." By evening, the decision had been made to transport the injured cub to a wildlife rehabilitation facility where it could receive continuous care. The question remained, what about the mother bear and the uninjured cub? Standard protocol would be to tranquilize the mother and relocate both her and the healthy cub to a safe distance from human habitation, Wilson explained. Then return the injured cub to them once it's healed. Sarah looked troubled by this solution. "But she came to us deliberately. She trusted us." "That's exactly the problem," Wilson replied gently. "Bears shouldn't trust humans this way. It makes them vulnerable to those who don't have their best interests at heart." As the adults debated the proper course of action, Emma approached the mother bear once more. The massive creature lowered her head to the child's level, their eyes meeting in that same mysterious connection that had first formed in the garage months ago. "Bear understands," Emma announced to the room of surprised adults. "Bear will go home now. Come back when baby bear is better." Before anyone could respond to this strange proclamation, the mother bear rose to her feet. She nosed her uninjured cub gently, then, with what appeared to be deliberate calm, began moving toward the door. Wilson moved quickly to open it, uncertain of the bear's intentions but unwilling to block her path. To everyone's astonishment, the mother bear paused in the doorway, looked back at Emma, then at her injured cub, who was now sleeping peacefully in a special transport carrier, and finally at the assembled humans. Then, with her uninjured cub following close behind, she walked out into the snow-covered yard and toward the forest edge. "She's leaving voluntarily," Dr. Jenkins whispered, frantically scribbling notes, "with apparent understanding that the injured cub will be cared for and returned." The gathered observers watched in silence as the mother bear and her remaining cub disappeared into the trees, leaving only tracks in the pristine snow as evidence of their departure. Inside, Emma stood at the window, her small hand pressed against the glass. "Bear says goodbye for now," she said confidently. "Not forever." In the weeks that followed, the Marshals' story spread far beyond their small community. National news programs featured segments on the miracle bear encounter, and wildlife experts from around the world weighed in on the extraordinary behavior exhibited by the mother bear. The injured cub, whom Emma had insisted on naming Brave, was recovering well at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Dr. Thornton sent regular updates and photos, which Emma insisted on keeping in a special album she carried everywhere. "I've never seen a wild bear cub respond so positively to treatment," Dr. Thornton reported during one of her visits to update the family. "It's almost as if he understands we're trying to help him." Meanwhile, Dr. Jenkins had established a research project to monitor the mother bear and her remaining cub, whom Emma had named Strong. Using non-invasive tracking methods and camera traps, they had confirmed that the bears had returned to a new den deeper in the forest. "She's exhibiting completely normal wild behavior now," Dr. Jenkins explained, showing the marshals footage from one of the cameras. "Foraging, teaching her cub survival skills, avoiding human contact with everyone except, interestingly, your family." The footage revealed that the mother bear occasionally brought her healthy cub to the forest edge near the Marshall home, usually at dusk. They never approached the house directly, but would often pause at the tree line, looking toward the house before continuing on their way. "It's as if she's checking in," Sarah marveled, "or showing her cub where help came from." The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had initially planned to keep Brave for several weeks before attempting to reunite him with his mother. But as January turned to February and the mother bear continued her regular appearances at the forest edge, a new plan began to take shape. "We believe Brave is strong enough for a controlled reunion," Dr. Thornton announced during a conference call with the research team and the marshals. "And we think your property might be the ideal location, given the mother's apparent comfort level there." On a clear February morning, a small team of wildlife professionals arrived at the Marshall home. Brave, now fully recovered but still smaller than his sibling due to his ordeal, was transported in a special carrier designed to minimize stress and human scent. Cameras were set up discreetly around the yard to document the reunion from a safe distance. The plan was simple but unprecedented. They would place Brave in a protective enclosure at the forest edge, then retreat to the house to observe. If the mother bear appeared, as she had been doing regularly, they would remotely open the enclosure, allowing Brave to reunite with his family without human presence. "This goes against all standard wildlife management protocols," Wilson admitted as they made final preparations. "But nothing about this situation has been standard from the beginning." Emma, now 15 months old and talking more each day, watched the proceedings with solemn attention. When everything was ready, she turned to her mother with unexpected clarity. "Bear is coming today," she announced confidently. "Bear knows Brave is home." The adults exchanged glances but knew better by now than to dismiss Emma's strange connection to the situation. They completed the setup, placing Brave in the protective enclosure with a clear path to the forest, then retreated to the house to watch and wait. Hours passed with no sign of the mother bear. Tension grew among the observers as daylight began to fade. Had they miscalculated? Would the mother bear sense the human activity and stay away? Just as dusk settled over the forest, Emma, who had been napping, suddenly sat up on the sofa. "Bear is coming," she said simply, pointing toward the window. All eyes turned to the monitors showing feeds from the outdoor cameras. At first, there was nothing but shadows and swaying branches. Then, movement at the far edge of the frame caught everyone's attention. The mother bear emerged from the trees, moving with cautious purpose. Behind her followed Strong, noticeably larger than when they had last seen him. The bears paused, sniffing the air carefully, clearly detecting the human sense and the presence of something new. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the mother bear might retreat. She turned slightly as if considering returning to the safety of the forest. Then a soft whimper came from the enclosure as Brave caught his family's scent. The response was immediate and electric. The mother bear's head swung toward the sound, her entire body alert with recognition. She moved forward with newfound determination, Strong following close behind. When she reached the enclosure, the mother bear circled it cautiously, sniffing at every inch of the metal structure. Brave, seeing his mother and brother, became increasingly excited, pawing at the enclosure door and making urgent, whimpering sounds. From inside the house, Dr. Thornton pressed the remote release. With a soft click, the enclosure door unlocked and swung slightly open. The mother bear jumped back, startled by the sudden movement, then cautiously approached again. What followed was a reunion so powerful that several of the hardened wildlife professionals found themselves blinking back tears. The mother bear gently nosed the door wider, allowing Brave to tumble out. The cub rushed to his mother, who thoroughly examined him with her nose and paws, as if checking that every part of him was truly healed. Strong approached more cautiously, seeming almost shy around his sibling, but soon the two cubs were tumbling together in the snow while their mother watched attentively. "Absolutely remarkable," Dr. Jenkins whispered, her pen flying across her notebook. "Complete family recognition after weeks of separation, immediate reintegration behavior. This defies all previous documentation of rehabilitated cub returns." The family reunion continued for nearly 20 minutes, the bears seemingly oblivious to the cameras documenting their every move. Then, as darkness deepened across the forest, the mother bear gathered her cubs with gentle nudges. Before disappearing into the trees, she paused once more, turning toward the house where humans watched in wonder. Emma pressed her hand against the window. "Bye-bye, bear family," she called softly. "Be safe." As if in response, the mother bear rose briefly to her hind legs, her silhouette powerful against the twilight sky. Then she dropped back down and led her reunited family into the shelter of the forest. The video of this extraordinary reunion, released with careful ethical considerations by the research team, captured the world's imagination. Wildlife conservationists, behavioral scientists, and ordinary people alike were moved by the footage of wild intelligence and what appeared to be gratitude displayed by the mother bear. This challenges our fundamental understanding of the boundaries between human and wild animal worlds, Dr. Jenkins stated in interviews. It suggests capabilities for memory, recognition, and reasoned trust that we've never before documented in large predator species. Winter passed with no further sightings of the bear family, who had presumably settled into a new den for the remainder of hibernation. The marshal's story continued to ripple outward, inspiring discussions about wildlife conservation and human-animal relationships in ways no one could have predicted. Emma's second birthday arrived with the first hints of spring. The Marshall family celebrated with a small gathering in their backyard, which Emma insisted on decorating with pictures of bears she had drawn herself. Colorful scribbles that somehow managed to capture the essence of her wild friends. Daniel and Sarah had been working closely with the wildlife research team throughout the winter, helping to establish a special conservation area that included the forest surrounding their home. Designated as a coexistence research zone, the area would allow for scientific observation while implementing strict protections for the wildlife within. "We want to understand this extraordinary relationship without exploiting it," Daniel explained during a community meeting. "These bears aren't pets or attractions. They're wild animals who, for reasons we're still learning about, have formed a unique connection with humans." As March turned to April and the forest awakened from its winter sleep, the wildlife cameras occasionally captured glimpses of the bear family emerging from hibernation. The cubs, now yearlings, had grown significantly over the winter. Brave showed no lasting effects from his injury, keeping pace with his brother as they explored their territory under their mother's watchful guidance. On a warm Saturday in late April, the Marshalls were enjoying breakfast on their deck when Emma suddenly put down her spoon and pointed toward the forest edge. "Bear family coming," she announced with her characteristic certainty. "All of them." Sarah and Daniel exchanged glances. Emma's unusual connection with the bears had become something they neither questioned nor tried to explain. Instead, they followed her gaze toward the trees, where the morning shadows were deep and revealing nothing unusual. "Are you sure, sweetie?" Sarah asked gently. "They might be busy finding breakfast of their own." Emma nodded firmly. "They're bringing something." Daniel reached for his binoculars, scanning the forest edge carefully. At first, he saw nothing but the usual spring landscape. Budding trees, patches of wildflowers, the occasional movement of small woodland creatures. Then, movement caught his eye. A flash of dark fur between the trees, following by another smaller shape. The mother bear emerged into a patch of sunlight, her coat glossy and healthy after the winter rest. Behind her came Strong and Brave, now nearly half their mother's size, and moving with the gangly energy of adolescence. But there was something odd about their behavior. Rather than foraging or playing as young bears typically would, they seemed to be moving with purpose directly toward the Marshall property. More strangely still, the mother bear appeared to be carrying something in her mouth. "Sarah," Daniel said quietly, passing her the binoculars. "Look at what she's carrying." Sarah focused the binoculars and gasped. "Is that a fawn?" Indeed, clasped gently in the mother bear's jaws was a tiny white-spotted fawn, so young it could only have been born days before. The bear was carrying it as carefully as she would one of her own cubs, the fawn's spindly legs dangling limply. "Call doctor." "Thornton," Daniel said urgently, already moving toward the yard. "Tell her to get here as fast as possible." As Daniel approached the forest edge, moving slowly to avoid startling the bears, he could see that the fawn was injured. One of its hind legs was bloodied, and it lay unnaturally still in the bear's gentle grip. Years of ranger training told Daniel that the fawn should be dead. Predator and prey didn't interact this way in the natural world. Yet here was a mother bear, a natural predator of deer, carrying an injured fawn not to consume it, but seemingly to bring it to help. Daniel stopped about 30 feet from the bear family, uncertain how to proceed. The mother bear paused as well, setting the fawn down on a patch of soft grass with surprising gentleness. The bear cubs hung back, watching curiously but making no move toward the vulnerable fawn. "I see you've brought us another patient," Daniel said softly, addressing the mother bear as naturally as he would another person. After all they had experienced, it no longer felt strange to do so. The mother bear made a low huffing sound, then took a step back from the fawn, her message clear. "Your turn." Daniel approached cautiously, kneeling beside the tiny deer. It was breathing shallowly, its wide eyes reflecting terror, but it was too weak or injured to flee. A deep gash ran along its hind leg, suggesting a predator attack, perhaps a coyote or feral dog, that the fawn had somehow escaped, only to be found by the bears. Behind him, Daniel heard Sarah emerge from the house with Emma in her arms. "Doctor, Thornton is on her way," she called softly. "Is it alive?" "Yes," Daniel replied, carefully examining the fawn without touching it yet. "But badly injured. I don't understand why they didn't." He trailed off, glancing at the mother bear who stood watching with evident intelligence. "They're helpers now," Emma said simply, wriggling to be put down. When Sarah hesitantly set her on her feet, Emma walked directly toward the bears with the same fearless trust she had always shown. "Emma," Sarah called urgently, but Daniel raised a hand to stay her intervention. "Let her come," he said quietly. "They've never shown any aggression toward her." Emma approached the mother bear with a bright smile. "Good bear," she said approvingly. "You helped the baby deer." The mother bear lowered her massive head to Emma's level, and for a heart-stopping moment their faces were inches apart. The tiny human child and the powerful wild predator, gazing at each other with what could only be described as mutual understanding. Then Emma turned to the bear cubs, who had grown considerably but still retained their youthful curiosity. "Brave and strong," she greeted them by name. "You're so big now." The cubs snuffled and made soft sounds, keeping a respectful distance but showing none of the fear wild animals should display toward humans. It was as if they recognized Emma as something familiar and safe, a friend from another world. Dr. Thornton arrived 20 minutes later, pulling up in her veterinary truck with a screech of brakes. She emerged with her medical kit, then stopped in astonishment at the tableau before her. Daniel kneeling beside the injured fawn, Emma sitting calmly with the bear family nearby, and Sarah standing watch with an expression that mixed wonder and maternal concern. "I wouldn't believe this if I wasn't seeing it with my own eyes," the veterinarian said, approaching slowly. "They brought you an injured fawn? Bears don't do that. They just don't. This family does," Daniel replied simply. "Can you help it?" Dr. Thornton knelt beside the fawn, her professional training taking over despite the extraordinary circumstances. "The leg wound is serious but treatable. It's suffering from shock and blood loss, but with proper care, it has a chance." As Dr. Thornton began treating the fawn, the mother bear and her cubs retreated to the forest edge, watching from a distance. Emma waved to them occasionally, as if providing reassurance that everything was under control. When the veterinarian had stabilized the fawn and prepared it for transport to her clinic, she shook her head in continued disbelief. "In 20 years of wildlife medicine, I've never seen anything like this. A predator bringing an injured prey animal to humans for help? It defies everything we know about natural behavior." Daniel looked toward the forest edge where the bear family still lingered, watching the proceedings with evident interest. "Maybe we don't know as much as we thought we did," he suggested quietly. As Dr. Thornton carefully loaded the fawn into her truck, Emma approached the bears once more. The adults watched tensely, but the interaction remained peaceful, the child and the wild animals communicating in some mysterious way that transcended conventional understanding. "Bear says more animals need help," Emma announced as she returned to her parents. "Forest is changing." The adults exchanged troubled glances, unsure what to make of this cryptic statement. But in the weeks that followed, its meaning would become disturbingly clear. The rescued fawn, whom Emma insisted on naming Lucky, made a full recovery under Dr. Thornton's care. When it was strong enough, it was released in a protected area of the forest where a doe had recently lost her own fawn to predators. To everyone's relief, the mother deer accepted the orphan, and wildlife cameras soon captured images of Lucky prancing alongside his adoptive mother. But the fawn's rescue turned out to be just the beginning of a strange and troubling pattern. Over the next few weeks, the mother bear and her growing cubs appeared at the Marshall property 3 more times, each time bringing an injured animal: a young raccoon with a severely infected paw, a red fox kit separated from its family, and most surprisingly, a great horned owl with a broken wing. Each time, the routine was the same. The bear family would emerge from the forest with their unlikely charge, setting the injured animal down at the edge of the Marshall property before retreating to watch from a distance as Daniel called Dr. Thornton for assistance. News of these extraordinary rescues spread rapidly through scientific communities and beyond. Wildlife experts and behavioral scientists from around the world requested permission to visit and observe, but the Marshalls, protective of both their privacy and the bear family's welfare, limited access to a select few researchers. "Something larger is happening here," Dr. Jenkins observed after the 4th rescue. This isn't just anomalous behavior by one bear family. There's a pattern emerging. Daniel had been thinking the same thing. During his regular forest patrols as part of his ranger duties, he had noticed subtle but troubling changes in the ecosystem. Certain plants were showing signs of unusual stress. Water levels in streams were lower than normal, despite adequate rainfall. And most worryingly, there had been a marked increase in sick or injured animals throughout the region. "I think Emma might be right," he confided to Sarah one evening after they had put their daughter to bed. "The forest is changing, and somehow the bears are aware of it." Sarah frowned, gazing out their bedroom window toward the dark line of trees. But why bring the injured animals to us? How would they even make that connection? Daniel had no answer, but the question haunted him as spring turned to summer. The research team installed additional environmental monitoring equipment throughout the forest, measuring everything from water quality to air particulates. What they discovered was disturbing. There are elevated levels of several contaminants in the watershed, Dr. Jenkins reported during an emergency meeting with forestry officials. And soil samples show traces of chemicals consistent with illegal dumping. Someone has been using the remote areas of the forest as a toxic waste site. The revelation sparked an immediate investigation. Forest rangers and environmental officers began systematic searches of the more inaccessible areas, while water quality specialists traced the contamination upstream to its source. Through it all, the bear family continued their mysterious vigil. The mother bear and her cubs were spotted regularly by the wildlife cameras, patrolling the forest with what researchers could only describe as purposeful attention. When they found injured or affected animals, they continued to bring them to the Marshall home, as if they had appointed themselves guardians of the forest's more vulnerable inhabitants. Emma's connection with the bears deepened in ways that both fascinated and concerned her parents. Now 2 years old, and speaking in more complex sentences, she often talked about what the bears told her with complete conviction. Many of her statements were childish fancy, but others contained details about the forest that were strangely specific and proved eerily accurate when investigated. "The bad water is behind the big fallen tree," she announced one morning at breakfast. "Bears showed me in my dream." Daniel, more out of curiosity than genuine belief, checked the location she described. A remote area where a massive old oak had collapsed across a narrow stream during the previous autumn storms. Behind the natural dam created by the fallen tree, he discovered a concealed drainage pipe that had been illegally installed to discharge chemical waste from a facility outside the forest boundaries. The discovery proved to be the breakthrough the investigation needed. Testing confirmed that the pipe was the primary source of the contamination affecting the forest ecosystem. The company responsible faced severe penalties, and an emergency cleanup operation was launched immediately. On the day the news broke publicly, the marshals were eating dinner when Emma suddenly put down her fork and turned toward the window. "Bears are happy," she said with a bright smile. "The forest will get better now." Sarah and Daniel exchanged the look they had grown accustomed to sharing, a mixture of wonder and uncertainty at their daughter's mysterious connection to the wild. "Did the bears tell you that?" Sarah asked gently. Emma nodded seriously. "They're coming to say thank you, tonight." After Emma had been put to bed, Sarah and Daniel sat on their back deck in the gathering twilight, watching the forest edge with a mixture of anticipation and skepticism. Despite all they had witnessed, it still seemed impossible that wild animals could understand concepts as complex as gratitude or environmental restoration. "Do you think she really communicates with them somehow?" Sarah asked, voicing the question they had both been reluctant to address directly. Daniel considered for a long moment before answering. "I think Emma has something special, an openness, an ability to connect that most of us lose as we grow up. Whether it's actual communication or just extraordinary intuition, I don't know. But I've learned not to dismiss what she tells us. As darkness settled over the forest, the familiar shapes of the bear family appeared at the tree line. The mother bear, now a familiar sight despite her wild nature, led her cubs toward the house with the same deliberate pace they had come to recognize. But this time, they brought no injured creature seeking help. Instead, the mother bear carried something green in her mouth, a small branch of fresh leaves that she placed carefully at the edge of the yard before retreating a respectful distance with her cubs. Daniel approached cautiously, using his flashlight to examine the unexpected offering. The branch came from a rare medicinal plant that rangers had feared had been completely wiped out in the region due to overharvesting and habitat loss. "It's woodland ginseng," he called back to Sarah in astonishment. "A healthy specimen. This hasn't been seen in these forests for decades." The mother bear watched as Daniel carefully collected the precious plant, her dark eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam with unusual clarity. Then, with what appeared to be a nod of her massive head, she turned and led her cubs back toward the forest depths. The ginseng plant, when examined by botanists, proved to be a particularly resilient variety that had somehow survived in a hidden corner of the forest, despite the contamination affecting surrounding areas. Its seeds and rootstock offered hope for re-establishing this valuable species throughout the protected woodland. But for the marshals, the plant represented something even more significant: a gift freely given, a communication between species that transcended conventional understanding. The mother bear, once trapped and frightened in their garage, had become something extraordinary, a bridge between the human and wild worlds, carrying messages and meanings that scientists were only beginning to comprehend. As summer progressed and the forest slowly began to heal from the contamination, the bear family's visits became less frequent but no less meaningful. They would appear occasionally at the forest edge, watching the Marshall home from a distance before continuing on their rounds of the woodland they had taken under their protection. Emma, growing more articulate with each passing month, continued to speak of the bears with a familiarity that both charmed and puzzled those who heard her. "The forest is speaking," she would say. "The bears are helping us listen." 2 years passed, bringing changes to both the Marshall family and their forest home. The cleanup operation had been successful, and the woodland ecosystem showed remarkable resilience once the source of contamination was removed. The Emma Marshall Wildlife Trust, established with the compensation funds from the company responsible for the dumping, had grown into a respected conservation organization focused on promoting coexistence between humans and wildlife. Emma, now 4 years old, had become somewhat of a local celebrity, the Bear Whisperer, as some affectionately called her. Though the extraordinary intensity of her connection with the bear family had gradually evolved into something more subtle as she grew older, she retained an uncanny understanding of forest creatures that continued to amaze researchers who worked with her. The mother bear and her cubs, now nearly adult size, remained a regular presence in the forest surrounding the Marshall home. Wildlife cameras captured their movements throughout the seasons, fishing in streams, foraging for berries, occasionally interacting with other bears who had moved into the recovering ecosystem. Dr. Jenkins, who had devoted herself to studying this remarkable bear family, had published several groundbreaking papers on their behavior. "What we're observing challenges the traditional boundaries we've established between human and animal intelligence," she wrote. "These bears display levels of memory, problem-solving, and what can only be described as compassion that force us to reconsider our understanding of wild consciousness." On a golden autumn afternoon, much like the one when the story began, the Marshalls hosted a small gathering to celebrate the official designation of the forest as a special research preserve. Scientists, conservationists, and local officials gathered on their expanded deck, which now served as both home and informal research station. Emma, dressed in her favorite overalls decorated with paw prints, suddenly looked up from the drawing she was creating. "They're coming," she announced, putting down her crayons. "All of them." The adults fell silent, following her gaze toward the forest edge. There, emerging from the trees with unhurried dignity, came not just the original mother bear and her now-grown cubs, but a small parade of forest wildlife: deer stepping delicately behind the bears, a fox family moving with cautious grace, even several raccoons, and a great horned owl perched in a nearby tree. It was as if the forest itself had sent a delegation to witness the occasion. The gathering of humans watched in breathless wonder as the procession stopped at a respectful distance, the animals regarding them with what could only be described as conscious awareness. The mother bear, now showing touches of gray around her muzzle but still powerful and majestic, rose briefly to her hind legs. For a moment, she stood like a sentinel between the wild world and the human one, embodying the bridge of understanding that had been so unexpectedly formed. Then, as silently as they had appeared, the animals turned and melted back into the forest, leaving only tracks in the soft earth as evidence of their extraordinary visitation. "What just happened?" whispered one of the officials, breaking the spell of silence that had fallen over the human observers. Emma, with the simple wisdom of childhood, answered before any of the scientists could formulate a response. "The forest said thank you," she explained, returning to her drawing with perfect contentment. "And goodbye for now." That evening, after the guests had departed, the Marshall family stood together on their deck, watching the sunset paint the forest in shades of gold and crimson. Emma, tucked between her parents, pointed to a distant ridge where 3 distinctive silhouettes could be seen against the fading light. The mother bear and her now-grown cubs, moving toward new territory. "Are they leaving?" Sarah asked softly, feeling an unexpected pang of loss. Emma nodded. "They have new forests to help, but they'll always remember us." Daniel wrapped his arms around his family, watching as the bears disappeared over the ridge. "And we'll always remember them," he said quietly. How one small moment of connection changed everything. For that was the heart of their extraordinary story. How a baby's innocent action in freeing a trapped bear had rippled outward, transforming not just one family and one bear, but an entire community's relationship with the wild world around them. The mother bear got stuck in the car in their home, but what Emma did truly saved her life, and in doing so, opened a door between worlds that had long been separate, creating a legacy of understanding that would endure for generations to come. In the years that followed, scientists would document similar instances of unusual cooperation between humans and wildlife in regions far beyond the Marshall's forest. It was as if a new possibility had been awakened, a remembering of ancient connections long forgotten in the modern world. And at the center of it all remained the simple truth that Emma had understood from the beginning, that compassion knows no boundaries, that helping transcends species, and that even the smallest hands can open doors to the greatest understanding. 25 years had passed since that fateful day when a baby named Emma had opened a car door and saved a mother bear's life. The story had been told and retold, documented in scientific journals and children's books alike, inspiring a generation of conservationists and wildlife researchers. Emma Marshall, now in her 30s, stood on the porch of the family home where it had all begun. Her parents had retired to a small coastal town, entrusting the forest sanctuary to their daughter, who had devoted her life to understanding the delicate balance between humans and wildlife. Her groundbreaking research on interspecies communication had changed how the world viewed animal intelligence, especially among large predators. The sanctuary had grown over the decades, now encompassing thousands of acres of protected forest, where bears and other wildlife could live with minimal human interference. A small research center at the edge of the property hosted scientists from around the world, all hoping to witness the extraordinary connections that still occasionally occurred between certain bears and the humans who respected their territory. On this particular autumn evening, Emma felt a familiar stirring in her heart as she watched the sunset paint the forest in shades of gold. Her 6-year-old daughter, Sarah, named after her grandmother, played nearby, arranging a collection of pine cones into intricate patterns only she understood. "Mom," Sarah said suddenly, looking up with eyes that reflected the same mysterious understanding Emma had possessed as a child. "Someone's coming to say goodbye." Emma felt her heart skip a beat. She had been expecting this day, dreading it even, though she had known it was inevitable. "Who's coming, sweetheart?" "The first bear," Sarah replied simply. "The one you helped when you were little. She's very old now." Emma knelt beside her daughter, searching her face with tender concern. Sarah had inherited her mother's unique gift, the ability to sense and somehow communicate with the forest creatures in ways that defied scientific explanation. It was both a blessing and a responsibility that Emma had carefully nurtured. "How do you know this?" Emma asked gently. Sarah tilted her head, considering the question with a child's honest simplicity. "She told me in my dreams. She wants to see you one more time." As twilight deepened into dusk, Emma and Sarah waited on the porch steps, hand in hand. The research assistants had gone home for the evening, leaving the sanctuary peaceful and quiet, except for the natural symphony of the forest preparing for night. Movement at the tree line caught Emma's attention. A slow, deliberate shifting of shadows that gradually revealed a solitary figure emerging from the forest depths. Even from a distance, Emma recognized her immediately. The mother bear, now ancient by wild standards, her muzzle completely gray, and her once powerful frame showing the inevitable effects of age and gravity. "It's her," Emma whispered, tears filling her eyes. "After all these years." The old bear moved slowly across the clearing toward the house, each step appearing to require concentrated effort. Despite her age, she carried herself with the same dignity that had marked her extraordinary life. Behind her, barely visible in the gathering darkness, other bears watched from the forest edge. Her descendants, Emma knew. Generations of bears who had been born and raised in this protected forest, carrying forward the legacy of understanding that had begun with one trapped bear and one fearless child. Emma stepped off the porch, moving toward the bear with the same respectful caution she had always practiced and taught. Sarah remained on the steps, watching with solemn attention as her mother and the ancient bear approached each other. When they were about 10 feet apart, the old bear stopped. She raised her head, meeting Emma's gaze with eyes that, while clouded with age, still held the same spark of intelligence and recognition that had marked their first true connection decades ago. "Hello, old friend," Emma said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You've come a long way." The bear made a soft rumbling sound deep in her throat. Not threatening, but communicative in a way Emma had learned to understand over years of observation. She was acknowledging their shared history, the extraordinary bond that had transformed both their lives and countless others. For several minutes they remained thus, the woman and the bear, facing each other across a distance that was both physical and metaphorical, yet somehow bridged by something greater than either of them. No researchers were present to document this moment, no cameras to capture it for posterity. This was private, sacred. a farewell between two beings whose lives had intersected in ways that had changed the world around them. Then, with deliberate movements, the old bear lowered herself to the ground. She lay on her side, her breathing visibly labored now that she had reached her destination. Emma understood with perfect clarity what was happening. The bear had come home, to the place where their story had begun, to complete her life's journey. With tears streaming freely down her face, Emma knelt in the grass a respectful distance from the bear. "I understand," she whispered. "You can rest now. Your family is safe. Your legacy will continue." The bear's eyes remained fixed on Emma, a lifetime of wild wisdom reflected in their depths. Behind them, at the forest edge, more bears had gathered, a silent vigil of furry witnesses to this final chapter in an extraordinary life. Sarah appeared at her mother's side, her small hand slipping trustingly into Emma's. "She's not sad, Mom," the child said with certainty. "She's grateful for everything." As night fell completely over the forest sanctuary, the old bear's breathing gradually slowed. Emma and Sarah remained with her, offering the comfort of their presence as this magnificent creature prepared for her final journey. Occasionally, Emma would speak softly, reminiscing about shared moments, the cubs rescued during the winter storm, the injured animals brought for help, the environmental crisis averted through their unexpected partnership. Under a sky filled with stars, the mother bear took her last breath. Peacefully, surrounded by the family of humans who had once saved her life, and the generations of bears who carried her blood and her unique understanding. When morning came, Emma and Sarah stood at the edge of a small meadow deep within the sanctuary. They had chosen this beautiful sunlit clearing as the bears' final resting place, marked by a simple stone engraved with a single paw print. Around them, the forest seemed to hold its breath, unnaturally still and quiet as they completed their farewell ritual. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her hand still firmly in her mother's. Emma looked down at her daughter, seeing in her young face the same innocence and wisdom that had allowed a small child decades ago to reach across the boundaries between species and forge a connection that science was still struggling to understand. "Now we continue," Emma said gently. "We protect what she helped us build. We remember what she taught us, and we look for new connections, new ways of understanding the world we share with all living things." As if in response to her words, a butterfly, brilliant blue and unexpected in the forest setting, fluttered between them, circling their heads before landing briefly on the memorial stone. Sarah's face lit up with delight. "Look, Mom! She's saying goodbye." Emma smiled through her tears, allowing the possibility to fill her heart. After all she had witnessed in her extraordinary life, who was she to say what was possible or impossible in this world of wonders? As they walked hand in hand back toward home, Emma felt a profound sense of both loss and completion. The circle that had begun with a trapped bear and a curious child had come full circle. But it wasn't ending. It was expanding, rippling outward through her daughter, through the bears that still roamed the protected forest, through the researchers who came to learn and understand, through everyone who heard their story and glimpsed the possibility of a world where the boundaries between human and wild were not walls but windows, offering glimpses of connection across the divide. The mother bear had gotten stuck in a car in their home all those years ago, and what Emma did had saved her life. But the true miracle was what that single act of compassion had awakened, a legacy of understanding that would continue to unfold long after both bear and human had returned to the earth that had nurtured them both. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Emma paused for one last look at the quiet meadow where her old friend now rested. The morning sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance across the forest floor. In that moment, Emma felt a presence, not physical, but undeniable, a sense of completion and continuation that transcended the boundaries of life and death. "Goodbye, old friend," she whispered, "and thank you." Sarah tugged gently at her hand. "She can hear you, Mom," the child said with absolute certainty. "And she says thank you, too, for everything." Hand in hand, mother and daughter turned toward home, carrying forward the legacy of a connection that had begun with a simple act of rescue and blossomed into something that would continue to transform lives, both human and wild, for generations to come. In the story of the mother bear who got stuck in a car and the baby who saved her life, there was no true ending, only new beginnings, spreading like ripples on a pond, touching shores not yet imagined in a dance of compassion and understanding that would continue as long as there were hearts open to the wild wisdom of the world.